Hi everyone, it's Miss Mary. We are on day 4 of Counting Coup. We are on chapter 9. Stories. My grandfather Yellowtail lived along the Little Horn River, and there were lots of old chiefs living in that valley. So many chiefs lived there that it was known as the Valley of the Chiefs. Chiefs were highly respected by the Crow people because they had earned their right to leadership on the battlefield. You did not get to be a chief by being popular because you came from an important family. You would become a chief only by performing the 4 required war deeds. For each deed, a warrior would be praised and led through the village. His clansmen basked in his glory, and dances were held in his honor. The successful warrior could tie an eagle feather to his hair or attach wolf tails to the heels of his moccasins as symbols of his military exploits, which were recognized and honored by all. Within 3 miles of us lived about 10 such famous old warriors, including great chiefs, Flathead Woman, Arm Around His Neck, Not Afraid, Old Crow, and White Man Runs Him. My grandfather One Star lived there too. During the sweat bath seasons in the fall and early spring, Grandfather Yellowtail would invite these old warriors to our house. I heard legends, myths, and regular stories from plenty of other people, but the war stories, the important stories, I learned from those old chiefs. They often would correct each other. Sometimes one would say, "That's not the way I heard it." He would then tell his version. That way, I sometimes learned several versions of the same story. Telling stories was important to the old people because everything they valued from pre reservation days was gone except their memories. They loved talking about the good old days when there were buffalo to hunt and they could enjoy the traditional life of the Plains Indians. Back then, of course, the chiefs had been the big shots, the leaders, but of all of a sudden, when the reservation was set up, everything came to a halt. Now a white Indian agent was boss. Chiefs were no longer chiefs. They were nothing. I think that's why they were always talking about the past, reliving it. After a while, the Crows began composing songs for their old chiefs. They were called honor songs. When they had a gathering, they would sing these songs. The first one was for my grandfather, Chief Medicine Crow. The idea spread quickly, and before long, all the great chiefs had honor songs. They still use them to this day. Those old chiefs enjoyed getting together for a sweat bath. It allowed them to shut out the white man's world and be Indian again. Each day, one of them would host a sweat bath. On the days our neighbor across the river, Chief Flathead Woman, would be the host, I would listen for his call. And when I heard him holler, I'd run and tell Grandfather Yellowtail, he's hollering for us to come. Well, let's go, Grandfather would say. Saddle up and let's go over across the river. On the days it was our turn, toward evening, Grandfather Yellowtail would start building the fire for the sweat bath. Then he would climb up on a hill and holler long howls. Hey! He would holler several times, and the neighbors would hear him 2, 3 miles up and down the river. Then, after a while, here they would come on their horses. Sometimes one or another of them couldn't make it, but those at home would all be there, usually 6 or 7 of the old chiefs. Then, while the fire was heating their rocks, they would sit down and start telling war stories. The old chiefs weren't the only storytellers. Grandfather Yellowtail was a great one himself. He would often tell stories in the evening. Sometimes visitors would come and spend the night and they'd tell stories too. I heard many stories during the cold winter nights. Some were simple legends, but most were true stories. Another good storyteller was my mother's grandmother, Kills in the Morning. She lived to be 117 and died in 1932 or 33. The strange thing about her was that her hair never turned white. It stayed black her entire life. She was blind for a long time. Because she was blind, she didn't know the difference between night and day. Sometimes she would talk all night. She would wake up and start telling stories, recalling the adventures of her younger days. She would talk for hours. I still have vivid memories of those stories she told me. Like the time that the stars fell from the sky, Kills in the Morning was a young girl that night, but the memory never left her. The stars began falling just as it got dark, she remembered. The stars were streaking this way and that, and there were many that lit up the sky. It seemed that some of the stars were landing on the nearby hills. The people of the village were terrified. The camp criers ran through the village and told everyone to put out their campfires, get inside their teepees, cover them with buffalo robes, and pray. They told them not to look up to the sky. Something was going to happen. Soon the whole camp was dark and quiet. Kills in the night went into her tent, but was too curious to stay under the buffalo robe. She stuck her head out from the bottom of the tent and watched the meteor shower. She said the stars continued to fall for several hours and then quit. Nothing bad happened to the village, and life returned to normal. But the crows never forgot the frightening experience. They named it the night when the stars started falling. This was a worldwide event that occurred in 1833. Kills in the Night was probably 13 years old at the time. The stories I liked best were those told about the experiences and adventures of great crow heroes like Wise Man. Wise Man. Wise Man lived in the mid 1800s. He was highly intelligent and could easily control animals and humans. One day in early spring, some crow men were discussing which wild creatures were the smartest, the wariest, the hardest to catch. Some claimed it was a coyote, some it was the mountain goat, others it was the magpie. Finally, it was agreed that the sandhill crane was the most difficult creature to get a hold of. No one could ever capture one alive, and no man ever will, the warriors agreed. At this point, Wiseman interrupted the discussion and said, I am ready to bet everything I own that I can catch a sandhill crane alive. Immediately, his challenge was answered by matching bets: a horse for a horse, buffalo robes for buffalo robes, weapons for weapons. When the bets were agreed upon, wise men doubting companions, he would return in a few days with a live crane. Wiseman left the village and sneaked into a nearby swamp when he knew cranes nested in the spring. He watched the cranes as they went about their daily activities, and waiting until their mother cranes left their nests in the search of their food for their chicks, he took off his clothes and hid in the water near several nests. When he spotted the mother cranes returning, he submerged himself in the water using a hollow reed to breathe through. The cranes were indeed wary. They flew around for some time before cautiously landing near their nest. When all was calm, Wiseman emitted a feeble chick call. One crane, apparently thinking that one of her young ones had strayed from the nest, started wading in the water toward Wiseman. As she got close to him, he grabbed her legs and carried her to shore. He tethered the thrashing bird so it couldn't get away and brought her into the village. After collecting his winnings from his astonished friends, Wiseman released a grateful crane, which immediately returned to her chicks. Another test of Wiseman's ingenuity occurred when a Sioux war party spotted him walking alone in the Black Hills. Wiseman sought refuge on a high point along a rocky cliff. There was no way for him to get down without being seen. The Sioux knew he was trapped, so they took their time climbing toward him, planning to count Coup on him. But Wiseman was making plans for a dramatic escape. He spread his blanket on the ground, then took two slender but strong tree limbs and tied the four corners of the blanket to the ends of the cross limbs. He grabbed the middle of the cross tree limbs and, forming a sort of parachute, jumped from the high cliff and floated gently to the valley below. The Sioux warriors charged into Wiseman's hiding place, but the Crow man was nowhere to be found. They looked over the edge of the cliff and saw in the distance Wiseman's dust as he sprinted away from them. The Sioux warriors must have shaken their heads in disbelief, thinking that the Crow man had used some sort of powerful magic in making his escape. They had no idea that Wiseman had invented a crude parachute and simply floated away. Chapter 10. Public school. One day during my third year at back to school, the door flew open and in stormed one star. He was a big, tall man, kind of rough in his ways. He walked up to my desk, yanked me out of the seat, and said, "Oh, come, this is no good. I'm going to take you to white man's school in town. You're just wasting your time here. You're not learning anything. You've been coming here all this time and you still can't speak English at all. I need you to interpret English for me, and you can't do it. Come." Then he walked me out of the room. The teacher just stood there and never said a word. Well, one star took me to the public grade school in Lodgegrass. The grade school had two rooms. In one room were grades 1 to 4, and the other room had grades 5 to 8. One star opened the front door and just pushed me in there. I tried to run out, but he held the door shut, and I couldn't open it. In the meantime, the teacher came to the door and hollered something, so my grandfather opened the door. He could understand English, but he could not speak it very well. She told him that I needed a doctor's certificate before I could come to the school. Come on, he said, I'm going to take you over to the doctor. He went over to Dr. Taggart's office. He checked me over and said, okay. He then gave me a note to my grandfather. He went back to the school again, and I went in. By now it was late afternoon, and I had finished the day rather quietly. This was a tough time for Indians to go to public school on a Crow reservation. The state of Montana had agreed to let Crow Indians attend public schools because the tribe had given 2 sections of every township to the county. This was a considerable amount of land, 50,000 acres. The white people in Lodgegrass did not like this decision and objected strongly. They felt that Indians should be going to school with their children. These Indians are dirty and covered with lice. They are so dumb the teachers will have to spend more time. They are so dumb that the teachers will have to spend more time with them and neglect our kids. Of course, the parents' anger and prejudice rubbed off on the kids. When I arrived at public school for the first full day, the teacher assigned me to a desk in front of Teresa Lind, the meanest little girl in town. Teresa had a safety pin, and when the class started, she began sticking it in my back, just in and out, all day, 50 times. I was afraid to say anything. It was just bad as my first day at the Baptist school. By the time I got home, Grandmother Bear that stays by the side of the house, stays side of the river's house that afternoon. My back was hurting all over. My great grandmother was waiting for me, anxious to know how things had gone. How was the white man's school? She asked. Usually, when I came home from school, my great grandmother would have biscuits and fried potatoes ready so I could make a sandwich for my after school snack. When I came in that day, the biscuits and fried potatoes were ready, but I wasn't hungry. I just flopped on the floor and sat there. What's the matter? She asked. Did the white boys fight you or do something to you? The white man's school is no good, I said. Look at my back. I couldn't see it, but it was hurting. She took my shirt off and shouted, what happened? You've got little red marks all over your back. Did somebody scratch you? Did something scratch you? No, I tried to explain about the little girl poking me with a safety pin, but before I could finish telling my story, I broke down and cried. That my great grandmother started crying too. She knew there was nothing she could do to help me. She was more scared of white people than I was. The next day, of course, I didn't go back to that school, but my great grandmother insisted I go. If you don't go to the school, they'll send you to a boarding school far away someplace. So I went back. Somebody must have said something to the teacher, however, because she moved me to another desk, and it was all right from then on. But I was in first grade again, and I was now about 10 years old, and I still couldn't read, couldn't write, and I couldn't do my ABCs or my numbers. The teacher spent a lot of time with me trying to help me catch up. The following year, my younger brother Arliss also attended public school. He was a big boy, much larger than I was, and the school got us mixed up. They put him in the second grade and me in first grade. That was all right with me, but after a while, the teacher realized my brother couldn't do second grade work, so we switched places. Then they put him in first grade and put me in second. That was all right too. Part of it was our fault. We Crow kids stuck together in school and only used English when we absolutely had to. We watched each other. If we saw one of our Crow classmates trying to speak English to a white kid, we would say, "Look at him, trying to be white man." We would tease him. Sometimes we would beat him up. We were afraid to use the English language, so we punished ourselves. Finally, I made it to fourth grade. Although I was now doing well as a student, I failed fourth grade because I skipped school on a final examination day. I didn't know what I was going to. I didn't know it was going to be an exam day. One of the older Crow boys in the class, Martin Spotted Horse, suggested we play hooky. I have some money, he said. Let's sneak out and go to the butcher shop. I'll buy some weenies and bread and we'll go into the hills and have a picnic. Let's go. He was much older than I was. We must have known we were to be tested that day and he didn't want to take the examination. I liked the idea of the picnic, so we went off. We got on our horses and sneaked away into the Wolf Mountains. We played around, roasted our weenies over a fire, and had a good time. The next day at school, the teacher handed out report cards. Kids were saying, "Oh, I passed, I passed." When I got report card, it said not passed. Martin didn't pass, and I didn't pass. We both flunked fourth grade, and slipped back another year. As I made my way slowly up the grades, the conflict with the white kids continued. Every recess, we had fights. After school, we did the same thing. If Indian kids were found in town after dark, the white kids would beat them up. We would have we would have pitched battles. There were 5 or 6 Belgian boys living on a farm below Lodgegrass, and we'd pick on them. As soon as school was out, we'd jump on our horses and head for the stockyards down by the railroad tracks. The Belgian boys had to walk along the tracks to get home, so we'd wait for them. Finally, they got smart. Their mother was a great cook. She'd make them a bunch of extra sandwiches for their lunch. Then, when we stopped them, they'd reach in their lunch boxes and give us each a sandwich. After that, we'd put on a big front to them just to get those sandwiches. We Crow boys weren't always hungry. We had to take our own lunches to school in those days, but we were so poor we never had enough to eat. My great grandmother would fix a couple of biscuit sandwiches with fried potatoes. That would be my lunch. We would carry the sandwiches to school in a little white salt sack tied to the saddle. When we got to school, we would tie our horses under some nearby trees and go in, but we would leave our sandwiches on the saddles. We were ashamed to take those potato sandwiches into school. However, a lot of magpies lived in those trees, and when they learned to fly down and peck the holes in the sacks and eat our sandwiches. More often than not, those magpies got my potato sandwiches, and I would come home hungry. That's why we were happy to get the sandwiches from those Belgian boys. The end for today.